Will be taken, and then Denise will go off for a few months and really build an update of the housing element that will come back in the fall to the Planning Commission for review, and then City Council ultimately for adoption. So the community will get another look at it, but by that time it will be a draft housing element that will be the beneficiary of your input tonight, which is very important. And as most of you know, but maybe not all, this housing element update is not only of tremendous focus by the state at this time because of the housing crisis statewide, but it's also really important to our small town as we look at the Fort Ord parcels that we have and potentially other properties that Denise is going to talk about with regard to how they might be developed and how housing might be a component of that development. So it looms large in matters of development that the city is considering at this time as well. And I also want to point out and thank our planning commissioners for being here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. And with that, I'll turn this over to Denise. Denise, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mayor and City Manager Pick. This is really an important time for us in the city, and I've been happy to represent and be a part of the city planning process for many years. And we've tried to complete the housing element process in the past, and I'm very excited, as Dino is, about getting this moving and started. So thank you. Just a few logistics before we start. There's extra copies of the full version of the PowerPoint presentation, so you don't have to see, and there's handouts at the front, and I'll go over what those are. So tonight I have with me Connor O'Toole, who's helping and available to take notes. We also hoped that this is really a listening exercise for us. First, we want to provide you as much information as we can so you understand the process and why we're here. And then we really hope to open it up for public comment and have everybody who wants to feel free to comment. And if you don't feel free to comment on the podium here, you can write us comment letters or whatever. So just to start, our agenda is going to an overview of the housing element and some historical perspective. It's been, as I said, some years that we've tried this in the past, but at this point we are starting fresh and brand new tonight. And it is important for everyone to understand what the housing element should be and is a part of and what's required to be in it. So we're going to go over the contents of the housing element. We're also going to go over the review and adoption process, some going through to determine and look at what policies we have now, because we're actually looking at the base document, and the housing element law requires us to show progress from the actually adopted housing element that we have and show status and progress before we can talk about other policies. What's important tonight too is there's what's called a land suitability or availability assessment, and we're hoping that we can provide enough information so the council and the public can provide comments on potential available lands that's suitable for housing. And when we're talking about housing, we're talking about housing for all segments of the community, and in particular affordable housing as well, and special needs housing. We're going to talk a little bit about the regional housing needs assessment, how the numbers that are mandated to us come down to the city, and then we'll get to public comment. So, in terms of the handouts that you have, what I'm doing is part of summarizing the actual three-part handout that you have in front of you. The first handout is a written summary that's about 3.5 pages that is really an overview of what housing element law and requirements are. So that way you have something to take back home and review and read for everyone's enjoyment. And then the second part of that is we also have a copy of the 1992 policies, the existing housing element policies, so everyone can understand where we're starting from, the framework, and then a copy of this presentation. And also tomorrow we will have this uploaded, hopefully, onto the web and have a specific location for everyone to go for housing element information. So the contents of the housing element is part of the general plan. There's 7 elements to a general plan. Housing element law was enacted in 1969, and it is being strengthened all the time in our current climate, which is great. There is an oversight agency called the State Department of Housing and Community Development, which we call HCD, and HCD reviews and looks at housing elements to determine whether they're in compliance. And our goal at the end of this year is to have a compliant housing element document as soon as we can, so that we are up to date with our housing element. And as part of that process, we really want to be able to outreach to different organizations. We had a large outreach mailer that Kim put together that went out to many different types of organizations and to the local community here too. And that's required, but also important to the city to make sure we keep engaged within the community throughout this entire process. So as part of that, we may be going to the Planning Commission and the Council a little bit more often than Dino identified, because it may be necessary for us to come back one more time prior to the actual drafting of the final drafting of the document. So we'll see how that works out. I wanted to just quickly go over the overview of the historical housing element. I know that Dino has presented this before the City Council, and I know some of the planning commissioners were around when we did the annual review of general plan policies back in 2017, including the housing element. But just generally, the housing element was first adopted by the city in 1992. And that is the document we have as our base document. Even though there was a general plan update done in 1995, when that's the first project I think ever did for the city, and a general plan that we have approved with 1997 when Fort Ord came into being, the housing element, the drafts that were done subsequent to that 1992 were never officially adopted or adopted by the City Council at that time. They were actually conditionally accepted by HCD, so we felt we had gotten a long way, but they were never adopted. So when HCD looks at our housing element, there's 8-year and 4-year compliance of getting a housing element updates. They look at us as just having one from 1992. Mm-hmm. So we've come a long way from there, and we're going to be able to show that this year. Again, in 2017, I thought it was important just to note that we really went through and conducted a full review of all general plan policies through the Planning Commission. It was a 5-year review that was requested, and it was right when Dino came on board, I think. So we were able to show and provide status with the planning commissioners and get feedback at that time. And today we're moving ahead for 2019. The law requires just very high level of specificity for housing elements. We get to look at, the city will gather a lot of data, and the city will, and we all will put together the needs of the types of housing, the overcrowding conditions, and actually a lot of this is already provided to us from HCD, so that's the really good part. But the city will have a good picture of where the city is in terms of housing stock, vacancy, rental, things like that. And then we look at using that analysis too, what's provided to us is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Plan, which is how much of each type of economic affordability is required to be implemented through the housing needs assessment. The second really important part is the site inventory and analysis of land. Housing elements require us to take a look at the available land, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, and really look at specific properties that may be able to hold and have development capacity for providing affordable housing. We also, through the housing element, have to look at what's in the city and in our area that is causing us not to be able to provide affordable housing, which there are real issues and constraints. First, we have to look internally. What are our land use controls that may be hampering development of affordable housing? And then we also will look at other constraints external to us, such as water management district allocation programs, no available water within the city, those types of very real items. And we look at those so we can see how we could overcome them. We develop programs to try and accommodate our share of the Regional Housing Needs Assessment for affordable housing. The goals would be to promote fair and equal housing, and we describe sort of the effectiveness of our previous element policies, which will be very interesting and easy to do from the 1992. We've done it before. And then we try and quantify objectives by income level, which housing is going to be constructed, rehabbed, or conserved over a certain planning period. And these are essential elements and programs we have that address just what I just said. We want to have programs for each of these specific areas. So a policy and a program. The policy is the overview, what's our goal that we want to do, and the program is how we specifically are going to achieve that. And each of these identifying adequate sites is an example of preserving at-risk conversion housing, providing equal opportunity. We will need to create good policy and good programs that HCD will accept, and they will definitely review each of these and likely give us suggestions if they're not adequate or strong enough. I think it's just important to understand that the housing element is a combination of a community's desires, and it's also not an isolated component of the general plan. It is a part of the general plan. So what we do with the housing element may actually mandate or require in the future a zoning amendment or general plan amendment, some other element that will of an update depending upon what the policies and the programs are. So it's something important to understand that as we move through this process. Again, we have a major need for revision at this point from 92 and even the 2007. You know, even though that was done, it was never adopted, so we can't start from that. Although I would like to and would be happy to provide, I think the city has access to it. If anyone wants to see the previous housing element update that was never adopted, it's totally available to the public. We did a full environmental document on it, and it had public review as well as 10 hearings over the process. So again, the overview is here's what we had before, and it's a set of what you actually have before you. We have a document that already discusses what progress was made, you know, through a certain time period. We're going to scrap that and just look at what's been made to date. This is an example of a new housing element policy from another plan that was an award-winning plan from the HCD website. And they provide, I think we'll probably be using this as an example, they provide the goals, objectives, policies, or programs. You need to talk about the responsibility for funding and the timing and set specific timeframes and objectives on how this is going to be done. This strategy is providing, or policies provide overall adequate supply of safe, attractive, and affordable housing for all persons and needs. It's not very dissimilar to one of your overreaching 1992 goals and policies. It's really interesting when you compare the two and when you compare the requirements today. So even though it's been a while, there is some valid information we could use. So this is an example. We will be looking at the vacant land inventory and the sufficient land as part of the housing element review process, and bringing that back to you, and hope to hear something about what your thoughts are about that tonight. I wanted to just specifically talk about what the previous site inventory that was done, because the requirements are you have to cite a specific location, provide the acreage, identify the assessor's parcel number, identify if they have water, and it's very specific. So in back over a decade ago, we looked at what was available at that time. The primary site that obviously comes up is the former Fort Ord site. We have had plans before proposed to have available affordable housing developed in that location, and it is a prime location because it actually has water for some affordability for housing. So it is definitely something that would be considered, and we would need to conclude it, I think, within the site inventory analysis. But just to let you know this, what was in before, because we'll go to the next slide, will tell us what opportunities might be. The 17-acre site that we've had a lot of discussions about was an opportunity site. The golf course driving range at that time was considered. And we also looked at availability of land for second units, even with water restrictions from Water Management District. We did an evaluation of what are the larger lot properties that may have second unit.
Are those ADUs?
accessory dwelling
Okay,
units. Yes,
yes.
I'm sorry, I'm the
Okay.
old version
That's okay.
discussion. Okay,
Thank you.
believe it or not, this is a new slide, so I want to prove it to you. There it is, a new slide. It's the same map. There aren't that many new locations that we've seen thus far, so we're hoping to provide a new analysis, relook at the Fordham property. I think we'd like to look at the Fordham property by segments as opposed to the entirety of the property now that the city has had done some work and has new development and developers associated with that area and only segments, and has appropriated it in some way. There's also, we want to look at other vacant or underutilized property, and if there's any city property that's available to be used or to be able to be shown as a site. There's certain requirements that when it is vacant and available, not available, vacant, we have to identify it on the site inventory. So I put this slide up just to give you the map again and to request any information that you have about any underutilized vacant property. When you provide your comments, give us any ideas. Uh-oh, Kim. I touched the wrong button. Again. This is the regional housing needs assessment, what we talked about before. Essentially, the government gets the Department of Finance numbers. Those are provided by county, by jurisdiction in terms of what's the regional housing needs and the requirements for each jurisdiction. And then AMBAG, who's our Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, our regional organization, they assign specific amounts of housing in terms of requirements. That'll be the next slide. There's actually a regional determination, and it's divided by income category. I think the interesting thing here is if you look at the different, and you can see it better in the if you have your glasses on, but if you look at the different populations, and this is for each jurisdiction within the city. Delray Oaks total population at the time was 1645. They talk about different households and types of households, and so we'll be able to provide a lot of information about the types of households by single, detached, etc. And then the next slide talks about, according to our current housing element, we are assigned the regional housing needs by income category of very low, which is a percentage of median income, low, moderate, and above moderate, for a total of 27 units. And you may think that's small, but our population size is small, and it's based upon Department of Finance numbers and transportation numbers, and it's assigned out. And at this point, I think it's also worthwhile to note that there has been very little, if any, housing developed as new housing within the city of Delray Oaks for many years, so that's why our numbers seem as large. If you compare that to all of the different jurisdictions, Monterey County-wide, for instance, the AMBAG region's 10,000, over 10,000, Monterey County is over 7,300. There's a specific process that HCD has to review and allow us to adopt the housing element so they can certify it as in compliance. That involves them reviewing it for up to 60 days. We also need to conduct environmental review to be compliant, to make sure we have to ensure we have comments from the public and that we engage the public throughout the process. There will be a draft document, as stated, and then there will be comments, and we will circulate the draft document and revise the document based upon public comments and HCD comments. Our most important information there is that we have a deadline, a very harsh deadline of December 31st, 2019. We're trying to beat that. And once we do adopt the housing element prior to that date, we will be submitting it as a final to HCD. They would have already provided their comments, and then they provide their determination. And we're in compliance for that time period. Basically, I think what this boils down to is that we have a real state priority and a community priority, if you want to couple those together. And we are missing out on potential to have some available grants if we don't have a housing element in compliance. We are also could have penalties for non-compliance. You may have read that in other jurisdictions. But more than that, I think that we have the ability, we have the time, and we have, the city council has funded us to provide a city that we can show there's adequate land that is zoned to be able to accommodate the allocation of units, and we would like to be able to meet the objectives to increase and accommodate housing on availability as required. We've got to address the critical issues of water, and there may not be, and funding for certain things. It may not be us developing the housing element and providing an in-compliant document may not mean that affordable housing can be built right away, or there's no market for someone else to fund it, but we have community partnerships that may be able to be done. Essentially, the requirement is legally we need to do it, and the benefits are many to be able to do it, and the opportunity is now, and it's great that we have a council and a planning commission that's so engaged. And so we want to be a part of the process to help solve this housing crisis from the state level. The city has land to address it. We are desirous to update the housing element, and we're looking forward for public comments. So.
Thank you, Denise. Thanks so much. Sure. Mayor, we do council comments perhaps?
Yeah.
All right.
Any council comments?
Sure. Actually, Denise, yeah.
Okay.
What's going to be the stepwise approval process? When does planning commission get engaged? When does council get engaged?
I'm glad you asked that very specific question. We were talking about it early today. We thought that the best process for us would be to, given that it's a small community, we have the opportunity to do so, is to develop more draft policies before we do the final draft document that goes before, and come back in either some sort of a workshop format with both city council and planning commission, something like this, so we can just outline some of the policies that we've developed as your staff, working with your city manager, and identify those in the separate categories, and you can provide input on it, or you can say we're ready to release it, or you can say do the whole document and put it out for the public to review. Any of those options are fine, because there is going to be the second opportunity, which is then we prepare the entire document. Public it goes before the public for the review period.
When you're saying entire document, the entire revised general plan, or just the element of the?
Just the element to the housing, yeah. The general plan is not a part, thank you for that clarifying question. The entire general plan is not a part of this. The housing elements are the only element that actually has a mandate by the state that has to be done regularly, and update, review regularly, and we're focusing on that. I think the entire document would be too much, especially by December.
And then but it's a city council approval. Is that what it is?
That's correct.
Adoption by city council.
So after the review, coming back with the full draft document that then gets a public review out for public review period, I think it's maybe up to 60 days, I can't remember. Then we come back, we put the comments in, that the draft documents turns into be an updated revised draft. We show you what changes have been made, and we then go before the planning commission again with the and they will review that final draft document. They make a recommendation to the city council, and the city council is the final determinant. And in that period of time, too, it's very important to note that HCD will be providing their comments on this draft as well. So we may be coming back, we will be coming back, and we will see HCD comments, which we will present to you and say, here's what they said. We've gotten the planning commission comments, the public comments, and here's what your document looks like now. And it'll be stricken out in red lines so you know what's changed, and hopefully it'll be
Do we know how, I mean, every council, every body in the state is going to be going through this process. So how do we anticipate HCD to be working overtime and turning?
We anticipate HCD to be working really well with us, and we've had a number of calls with them already. We started out the process earlier on this year, and I've engaged with the mayor, with the city attorney, and the city manager, with the HCD on the phone, and they are very supportive of moving us forward and helping.
Okay.
We are not the only small city in the state that has a very outdated housing element, and they recognize that.
I have a couple other questions.
Yeah.
Regarding the RENA, what's the plus and minuses to our RENA number, and then are there credits for exceeding that number? So we have a RENA number now of 27, which is the first time I didn't know what our RENA number was. This is the bane of so many other jurisdictions. That doesn't look like a difficult number to meet, but what's the plus and minus of having a number of this value? And then, are there any credits for exceeding that number?
Well,
New credits, meaning that with the state and the supermajority and the governor's push, is there any bonuses for a community like us that has an opportunity to exceed this RENA number that could be substantive?
I'd have to, on the first part of the question, what are the benefits of having a lower number?
Pluses, yeah, plus or minuses.
Okay, the pluses or minuses, we don't want to get, the minuses as we don't want to get lulled into the thought process where maybe not, if we can provide more, we shouldn't. The benefits are that we can be compliant faster with the HCD, which is our really number one objective. So I think for us, the importance would be to go in and show compliance, that we can achieve compliance with this number. The benefit of going and having a higher number, I'd have to actually look to see what specific benefits and talk to HCD there would be about that. When we had the previous housing element, it was a combination with the second one that we did, the draft, with the making some changes in the Fort Ord area.
Yeah.
So we had a higher number, and we breezed through the housing element compliant part of it. So I think that's probably a decision that gets made. We also can, once we adopt this housing element, we will be within what's called a requirement for a 4-year cycle. Well, within 4 years after this, we have to re-adopt with making some change or some progress. So starting in 2020, we need to be able to show some progress in 2020, in the next cycle, 2023. So that may be opportunities for more specifically moving into that.
The measure of compliance right now is just showing a path to getting to this 27, is that correct?
The measure of compliance is showing the path to get into the 2017, to make the 27.
27.
Right. I don't want to make it sound easy, because there are a lot of very specific housing needs policies and important elements that the HCD will check to make sure we've got covered. And many jurisdictions find it difficult to make those policy decisions on a certain level. So I think it's going to be important. That's why I really want to come back with some of the policies.
Okay. So the format of the housing element, that looks like a very readable format. Is it, but that format, the award-winning format that's on the HCD website, is it though in the format of, say, these new applications or these new programs that are going to be coming out of this next legislature? And the reason I ask that is that, we have this opportunity to kind of start fresh, and I'd like to craft something that can just easily be dropped into an application for a grant application, or with very nominal or very minimal kind of modification. Do we have any idea of what those new grant applications, those new programs are going to be, and what those requirements are going to be to apply for those?
That's a good question. However, we don't, because we don't know what the grants are yet. I think we're really focusing on getting the document done and availability for grants, but we know that there's funding available, and I think that's actually a great question to come back to you with maybe at the next meeting.
Okay.
Because there are grant monies available for in compliant cities.
No, there's a plethora
And-
of sticks. The way we were told when we were at the is that there's sticks and carrots, but the carrots look like just orange bats.
Okay.
Okay, those
Thank
were my
you.
questions.
Yes, I'd like to know, well, thank you for this great presentation. It was very comprehensive. Does HCD ever require, like when a home is up for sale, that it be part of a housing, part of the housing, the low housing?
Oh, you mean by individual single-family home ownership and then
Yes.
require, and then the homeowner wants to sell their property and the HCD, I've never heard of it where they've required a single-family homeowner ever
Okay.
to do that, no. To mandate affordability, no.
please?
I have a few questions and some suggestions, but I don't know if they're part of the housing element or something that has to be dealt with later. First of all, as far as existing affordable units, I live in the condos, and I do know that there's 6 or 8 units that when those condos were built, which was 1989, 1988, there are 6 units, or there were 6 units in there that were considered infill or low-income affordable. Now, you know, do those expire? Does that
Depends on their
So,
category? I know from personal experience at the time when I bought here, I also looked at some infill out in the county lands, and there were specific limits. It was owned by somebody, but there were specific limits. My income could not exceed a certain level. So I don't know if that gets grandfathered or if that, after a certain period of time, expires. And I know that in Castroville, there's an issue with that. So that's something that I'd like to get a little bit clarity on.
sure, I think there's 2 parts to that question. One is specific to the units and the condos, which I don't have the answer to in terms of whether they have a specific deed restriction to require them to be at a certain level of affordability and an income level in perpetuity. I think maybe the city can take a look at that if possible, because that would be part of our either previous housing stock for affordability, or it could go into a new housing stock for affordability. And then secondly, yes, there are, if I remember the question now, there are different areas of the county where you have deed restrictions on, after the creation of affordable housing. I think the goal is to try and maintain those housing affordability limits, and if people do want to move out and move up, then new people can move in and take the advantage of that. So usually there would be some sort of deed restriction. It depends upon the development. We'd work with the city attorney. Depends upon, sometimes there's community partners that come in and do that. CHISPA is one of the organizations that's been around for a long time doing that. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay. And then, like I said, I had some thoughts or ideas. I'm not sure if they belong in the housing element or if they go to the planning commission and go into our ordinances. Obviously, we need to encourage environmentally friendly yet affordable construction methods. But on the same side, we need to be careful on the density for safety, for wildfire issues. I mean, especially if you're looking at the Fort Ord lands. I mean, a fire could go through there like all get out. And the other thing is one of the suggestions I heard recently from Jane Parker was to make, to encourage affordable development would be to have the developer fees based on the square footage of the homes as opposed to a per unit fee, so that if you build a bigger home, the developer's got to pay the city a bigger developer fee. If you have a smaller home with fewer bedrooms, and we need to encourage not just family homes, but we have a lot of singles, we have a lot of just couples or people who are just starting out with one child who only need a 2, max 3-bedroom home, or people like me who are at the age where they want to downsize. So by encouraging smaller homes, they're more affordable. So I'm not sure if that
That could
putting this
translate into
fee-based
a policy.
Is that a policy that would go into the?
The way it could go into a policy is what Supervisor Parker was talking about, was the county inclusionary housing ordinance. And the county has such an ordinance, and so her idea is specific to how do you manage that and make it better. The city could follow in the footsteps of many other jurisdictions and adopt an inclusionary housing ordinance, and whereby you could put some of those parameters in there, and that would be, in the context of the housing element, that would be sort of an overall reaching statement of policy, and then the objective would be adopt a housing, inclusionary housing ordinance with some of these specifics in there by a certain date. And that's what HCD wants to see, is that I have this idea, I think it's a good one, let's put it into effect by making an ordinance, and says, so the program is adopt an inclusionary housing ordinance. Believe it or not, that was one of the programs, I think, from before. So that's how those ideas can translate into more specifics.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I just want to follow up on that. So what I'm hearing, I just want to make sure I'm absolutely clear. So we can pass that ordinance this month, next month. Is that tied to the work we're doing here?
So you have, as a council and a city and community, and Alex can talk about this more appropriately, but an ability to create your own ordinances and et cetera. So in the context of the housing element question that was posed, which was how would we do something like this, the start would be would be develop a program that says adopt a inclusionary housing program or ordinance, and then you would have the objective as to do this by this date. I'd like it if you were to do it, have it in our housing element, and then we could have a very specific program, and we could check that off, and then you move toward doing that and implementing that.
Great.
So the real, I think, follow-up is, you don't necessarily have to make all that happen to do the general planning aspect of the housing element. That's the.
But it makes us look good if we accomplish it,
Everyone wants to
right?
be A's, A
Check a
students
box. Okay, thanks. Can you tell me a little bit about the 5-year Planning Commission review and what goes into that and how that affects?
That was really a separate process that was requested by one of the planning commissioners. It's under, it's an annual, we have different things under HCD. There's an annual planning review, APR report that says how many, you have to submit. And then there's something in state law that talks about, every 5 years you should have your planning commission review the general plan elements and their land use policies and provide a report to the city council about those. So we were complying with that, and we were able to have a series of meetings over a number of months with the planning commissioners, and I think it was really worthwhile. They reviewed every single policy individually, and I think we also provided a report of their, just basically tables of the comments. And to go off track for a little bit, I think some of what was very surprising is how common even the older policies from the older general plan were still endorsed by the planning commission. And then, of course, there were some that would need updated.
Can you also talk a little bit about how RHNA numbers are calculated and how that may or may not tie into the 20% required affordable units?
Well, I think you're referring to the 20% required affordability under the county ordinance, or is that? Fort Ord, okay. Well, the RHNA is a somewhat complicated process that goes first from the Department of Finance and then through HCD, and they have, all, these numbers that are actually based on transportation demand numbers too. Then it goes to AMBAG through the process, and then through a collaborative process, AMBAG being our regional agency for coordinating on this. The different jurisdictions get involved and they divvy up these numbers. AMBAG actually divvies them up, and then we react to them as a city. And I can provide more information on that. It gets into some detail and process-wise. How that relates to the Fort Ord Inclusionary Housing Ordinance, I'm not sure I know, and I'd have to get back to you. Specifically, the Fort Ord inclusionary requirements are mandated through, we have the city of Delray Oaks, and then we have the city of Delray Oaks Fort Ord area, as everyone knows. That, as part of that area, we are part of the Fort Ord reuse planning area, and have a series of policies, programs, et cetera, that we must comply with. So that would be a part of any development that occurs within that area, or any planning that occurs within that area. Not much of an answer, but
Okay. And can you talk about the other elements that are part of the general plan and how they intersect with the housing element?
Well, I think for the most part, the primary two elements that intersect with the housing element are the land use and circulation. I mean, anything, wherever you place housing is going to, we're going to have traffic circulation, and then the land use is very specifically because, HCD and housing elements and land use elements identify a certain amount of development, and with the housing element, there'll be times when the HCD would like to see a higher level of density on certain properties because they're promoting affordable housing, and more affordability means more housing in order to achieve that. Some of the other elements like safety, recreation, all the other ones, they're less so, but they're interwoven. Much less, I think, than the two main ones, which are housing and circulation.
So do you...
Seismic safeties, you have to have a safe
Right,
homes.
sure. So would a requirement for something such as the amount of open space on a large piece of property, where would that come in?
That would come in the land use
Okay.
element of the general plan.
I think that's all I have for now. Anyone else on the council?
I do. Just a comment, since I'm the city representative on AMBAG. AMBAG is just starting its next cycle of calculating the RENA numbers, and those will come out, I think, 2022 or 2023. So, I mean, our timing is almost perfect with this, because once the new numbers come out, we have to relook at our housing element anyway. So, in 4 years, we'll be back here.
Well, and when is our cycle?
Well, we're at the end of what's called our fifth cycle. So the fifth cycle would have been adoption by this year.
Okay.
And then you would be able to be you would have had to have adopted a new housing element that would have been compliant with HCD by, I think, 90 days after January 1st, 2019. This gets all really complicated, but so we are in what's called the fifth cycle. What Councilman Goetz is talking about is the sixth cycle. And so we are looking at the RENA numbers from the fifth cycle, and we have a deadline by the end of this year because we're going into the next cycle rather quickly.
Okay. Anything else from the council? No? All right, I'd like to open it up for public comment.
I'd just like to make a comment about John's question regarding grants.
Scott, could I ask you to come up
Sure.
to the, thank you.
Oh, and may I ask, just would everyone, just for our note takers, state your name, please? Oh, thank you. Scott.
Yes, I am Scott. Scott Donaldson, Portola Drive. But you asked about the grants. I recently attended the Planning Commissioners Academy, and they talked about SB2 grants that are available, and one of them is a non-competitive grant. It's $125,000, and from what I understood, it was just to update the housing element. In other words, you didn't have to compete for it. You were given $125,000. And I thought it was for this process, but from what I understand, it's not. It's later on, but it is money that we will get. Is that right, Dino?
Yeah, I checked into that after you came back with that information from the Planning Commissioners Academy, Scott, and it requires us to be compliant, unfortunately, in order to compete for that money. And it's not, actually, I don't think compete's the right word, to get that money, because there's not much competition involved if you apply for it.
Right.
But we do have to have a compliant housing element, which we don't.
So once it's in compliance, we just submit the application and we get the money?
Right.
Yeah, and
That's my
just to
understanding.
let everybody know, that's $125,000 that they will give us for that process. Okay.
Thank you. Please.
I think that's such an important thing, that aspect of the timing of this. Once we get compliant, if it's before December 2019, that's available to us. And so the timeframes that we have and what we're doing right now, we're really focusing on getting that to that deadline, sooner rather than later in terms of the end of December deadline.
Are there other grants that you're aware of that we could take advantage of?
There are a number of grants that we're not allowed to go after.
Once we're compliant. Yeah.
And I just don't have them in front of me. I actually printed them out and left them. But if we record that question, we can get back to you. I think it's SB2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Come on up.
Frederica Jones, Hillwell Place. So I'm not sure if this is the appropriate place to ask the questions, but I wanted to find out, once the affordable housing has been determined, I know that there was a need that was identified on your policy and programs to meet the needs of very low income, and elderly households. So is that the intent of how we as a community are moving forward to, as far as meeting those specific needs of the very low income and affording them an opportunity to, is it to buy the home or is it to rent the home? And then also, who dictates or who allows or makes the determination? Does it just go with the low income, or could it be housing for teachers? Or housing for, I read somewhere where 400 affordable housing units are going in, and looks like it's going to try to be designed for the airport employees, on an article that just came up. So I was kind of unclear who specifies on who's going in there, and is it for rental purposes only, or is it for home ownership? And then, how does the affordable housing, does that go? Is it comparable with the Section 8 process that we had before, where the fair market value is $1,500 for rent, and the affordable housing would be reduced at maybe $800, and then this grant would pay the difference between the fair market value and the low housing income? So how does that work, and is that applied towards grant or special housing funding as part of this package, is the other one. And then the other thing that I have is, or the question I have is, is there a requirement by the city then to make a report such as, yes, we have 27 housing units and 20 of them have been designated for the elderly and we're in compliance with that? Or is that something that can be manipulated where to state just in compliance, where we just allow just anyone move in that falls in that low housing criteria? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So those are the questions that I had, and like I said, I'm not sure if this specifically is the venue for that, but those are questions that I haven't seen anywhere, or if it's been addressed or developed. So, thanks.
So, Madam Mayor, thank you. If I can just make a couple of comments on that series of questions, which are terrific and will capture, hopefully, to address more systematically. The purpose of the various income level housing numbers that we are provided for by RENA, at least the spirit of the law, as I understand it, is to make housing available for all, right? Not restricted by vocation necessarily, or certainly by ethnicity or any type of category. Having said that, it doesn't preclude us, and we've already started this discussion with our development team, who's here in the back of the room, John and Edward Treble, of having housing for teachers, and with a focus of having it as affordable as possible, while not necessarily having it fall into the range of the RENA numbers, perhaps the high end of the RENA the category, right? 120% of median income and higher perhaps, but, so they're not mutually exclusive, is kind of at the point I want to make here. We need to be trying to make progress towards an affordable housing mix based on the numbers we're allocated by the state. But we can also, as we discussed separately with our developer, as part of how we want this, how the community wants Fort Ord to look, certainly talk about teacher housing.
And is that rental or is that property ownership?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
But we'll get you better.
I was just curious.
Yeah,
As far
no,
as,
thank you.
know,
I want to hear this.
Okay.
I think that's where it's going to be.
He'll answer.
You're just going to come up?
Yeah?
Good afternoon, Matt.
Good, Mayor, council members, my name is Matt Huerta. I'm a housing program manager with the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership. Thank you for joining us recently as members. We're really pleased to have you on board, and so really want to be here to just kind of introduce Monterey Bay Economic Partnership to you all. Some of you know us better than others. Look forward to working with you as you go through this process. We work with several other jurisdictions throughout the 3-county region that we work in. Our membership is pretty much consists of over 80 of the largest employers across the 3 counties, both public, private, and nonprofit. And we have several initiatives around workforce development, transportation, and housing, and so I head up the housing team. We have 3 or 4 folks that work in the space. And someone had mentioned earlier just an example of an approval that was just recently passed this week by Monterey as an example. So that's an example of our advocacy work where we worked with several business leaders and residents and housing advocates to work over the last 6 months or longer to support that effort, because we felt that it met our mission in terms of trying to see housing developed at various income levels to meet the needs of, in that case is Monterey, and they had a housing regional needs allocation of 650. So it's a little different than yours. Yet they've only been able to achieve about 80 over the last 4 or 5 years. And so there was an election, and folks, the leadership there are currently much more proactive around trying to get a hold of ahead of their goals now. And so you've seen recently that there's been some fairly significant progress toward those goals, in the fact that up to 405 potential units. Again, there's the differences, as you heard from your consultants, that, and it was clarified here at the dais, that the cities and the local governments across the state are required to plan for these housing goals, right, that come from the state and are doled out at the regional levels. And that's really what your role is to essentially identify what the barriers are, try to remove those barriers, try to identify the paths that the community and the development community can move forward through. And so there's a series of things that you can do at the policy level, and we've actually taken a really hard look at that over the last couple of years, and we developed a white paper. I encourage you to read that. We can have subsequent meetings about that. I can come back and we can do another mini workshop on it if you want. We've done that for several other jurisdictions. Monterey actually, leading up to some of these other decisions, actually went through our 9 recommendations and kind of did their own score. And they said, we're doing good here, not so good there, we want to move here, and they started to kind of put together a plan. And so it can lend itself to that, and it ranges from, as was mentioned earlier by council member, and one of our presentations was at the county, and I'm glad someone was taking notes. Sounds like Supervisor Parker was taking really good notes, because one of our key areas is what can we do in terms of working with the market rate developers to remove some of those barriers and still move forward ahead with more housing supply, again, at different income levels. And the fee structure is somewhere where we can really make a difference by encouraging smaller, more affordable homes without throwing a lot of subsidy at it, which, raise your hand, very few jurisdictions have a lot of subsidy to throw at housing. So how can we work with the marketplace to move forward with projects and still achieve some of our housing goals? So that's just one example. There's several others. I'm here for any other questions that may come up, immediate to a person, just so that other folks know in the room. I've been doing affordable housing development work for about 20 years, and worked for different nonprofits as a project management level on a specific projects, farm worker housing developments here in our region, as well as I work in the Bay Area on some higher density projects, currently even in Palo Alto and San Jose. So I work with Monterey Bay Economic Partnership to help them implement their initiatives, but I have a lot of other support that I can lend. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
We're glad to have you on the team.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Matt? Sure. We read the white paper before, but I read but it was before we went to SAC and realized, I guess the intensity at which the legislature and the governor are pushing for
Right.
this. And honestly, I cannot remember the 9 points, but do those 9 points map to all of the emphasis of what the legislature is putting through with all the SPs and assembly bills that are going through?
Yes, so, we're very much in step with where the state's headed in terms of trying to ratchet up, as you said, the carrots and sticks, mostly sticks.
Right.
It seems like they're kind of, right now, they're giving folks enough chances to kind of come on board. They're actually throwing money at it. It was mentioned SB2, right? That was dollars that can help, because people say, okay, well, you're having, the state, jurisdictions across the state are saying, well, you're asking us to plan for this, and, we don't have staff or capacity to do it. Okay, remove that barrier now. Now you have some money to do it.
Right.
So we're trying to remove all these reasons why cities can't at least have a solid plan. Again, there's a difference between having a plan and actually building it. So there's plenty of jurisdictions out there that actually have good plans and still very little or no housing. So we'll still have those other challenges to meet, but I think the first thing is to have a really good community engagement process where you have residents that are here that have the stake in what the community looks like. They're going to engage, have their questions and input, and we can help with to make sure that maybe as many of the solutions as we can put together make sense.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if this question is it Matt?
Sure.
Or Denise, I'm not sure, but
Probably Denise.
I'd like to know more about...
Can you tell us who you are for the
Sorry, I thought I was
record,
getting
please?
new. Sorry. Katie Krieger on Quindale. I'd like to know more about mixed-use developments, and are there incentives from the state that would be beneficial to us economically or defray costs? And then another thought that I'd like to know about is there an element of including something that helps the fight against global warming? I know
I'm
that...
sorry, did you?
Oh, sorry. Is there I'm addressing them because I'm asking them the questions, but I can talk to you too if you like. Did you hear everything so far?
Most of it, yes.
Okay, so I'm wondering about mixed-use development, and if there are grants or things that will defray the cost for the city or be beneficial from a tax point of view or anything like that. And then I'm also wondering about, as we have our climate change challenges, are there any incentives or benefits to the developers or the city or any of the key stakeholders to making sure that we have minimal destruction of existing trees or anything that helps mitigate problems with climate change? So those are two questions, and I don't imagine you're going to answer those tonight, but when do they get answered? Like, the questions that we have, can we kind of expect that? Oh, I can ask more later. That's fine. No, please.
I'm just writing them down. Sure. No, please. So those are great questions, and they're associated with, as well as the speaker, is it Mrs. Jones? Jones, sorry. About what are the specifics? Are we going to buy the home, rent the home? Is this going to be mixed use? Is this a other type of development. And it kind of, the analogy is, at this point, we are designing the plan for that building, the house. And we don't yet know what the faucet's going to look like that we want to put in the bathroom on our first floor. So we are really at the point where we're trying to understand what programs, overreaching goals, envisioning in some ways that we can be doing in order to develop those more specific answers. But to be specific about it is that, yeah, there could be a policy about renting or home ownership. It could be part of the inclusion housing ordinance. Yes, we could have a requirement to have the city make a report to ensure that we have continuation of affordable housing units, as Mrs. Jones pointed out. Do we know more about mixed-use development? One of the links between the housing element and the land use element is, what do you want to see? And, you know, hopefully if you can also provide input, is that maybe what we'd like is, we'd like to see somewhat of an area where you have first floor commercial, second floor housing, and that would be both in terms of a goal or a policy in the housing element, and then it translates also to the land use element. So this probably doesn't answer everything that you're going to be asking, but it does say that this is the start, this is the start to get us through to look at what we want to see, what does the community want to look like, and as part of that, the major reaching goal is, can we provide levels of the housing and meet the housing needs at each of these affordability levels, and including workforce housing and other type of housing. There are some elements that you could put in terms of the global warming that's about energy use and construction type of development that's appropriate for the housing element. I don't think it is a mechanism to fight against global warming or climate change. I think you know that, but it's something that you can put in as an overreaching goal. So, and the next steps are providing some goals based upon what we're hearing today and from the council, and bringing those back. So, I don't know.
I think step two is one step.
Yeah, and I just want us to make sure that, with all due respect, that we hear from the community about the things. So can we put you on hold for just a minute on answering questions for this, because we really want to hear from you. But I'm also trying to get input on the housing element from the standpoint of, is there anybody that has an overall question, and so then you can come up after, on, or a comment on where you'd like to see housing, affordable housing from the land availability, any other policies that you'd like to see in the document, and then we'll have Matt come in at the end and bring some of those issues home that are more specific to the details. And it also sounds like there may be an opportunity for you to come back and actually do a presentation on more of the global specifics of how the city could work towards some of the more interesting aspects of funding and things that you brought up. So, not to take over moderating, but.
My name is Kevin Raskoff. I live on Baxter Place. And I have 3 questions, and I'm not sure, I can ask them separately or all at once. I don't know what you prefer. Denise, do you like us just to run them off? Run them off. All right. I think they're actually more for the council than for Ms. Duffy, though. First one, very simple. You mentioned, Denise, that there was some sort of informative document that was circulated or put together by Kim, but I don't know what that was. Do you remember what you were referring to?
Is that this?
It was that handout. Oh, okay, I thought it was a separate thing that was maybe mailed out that I had missed or something like that. Okay. Second thing is kind of going on the comment that you just were addressing in terms of this process, kind of going to the council. What will be the city and really the city council's process for balancing the need of the mandated 27 units that we now know about versus the needs or the desire for more money for expanded development of some sort or another versus the need or desire for green or open space? What's the process going to be like? When and how will those things be decided? And I'll take that answer, and then I'll maybe come back for one more question after that.
Kevin, that's a great question. I think it's beyond the scope of the housing element. by definition, but I think where it can and should be addressed is during the public outreach meetings that the development team has with the public in the, about the development and what it might look like, what it should look like on the former Fort Ord. And those, and just to be clear, those outreach meetings will be taking place, if we move forward, will be taking place before land sale. So during a period, if we enter into an exclusive negotiating agreement with the development team will be doing some public outreach to try to scope what this project should look like. And during that time, there may be others, but certainly during those meetings and that process is when I'm certain they will want to hear, and I know I will want to hear, and the council will want to hear, our residents' opinions and views about open space, about the nature and extent of housing, which that will relate to the housing element process, the nature and extent of commercial building, whether it be light industrial or retail. And eventually, the development team is going to get to the point of developing a specific plan, which will have a fair amount of detail in terms of what that mix looks like. And it'll be something that comes before the planning commission, before the city council, and again, before the public.
Okay. Make a follow-up comment, is that all right? Sure. Okay. With respect, like the developer partners that we have, at least currently, is there, I'm very naive on all this stuff, does the city council say this is what we want, this is what the city said it wants, and the developers have to say, okay, we'll do that? Where do the rights of the developers to sort of do what they want to do begin, and the rights of the city to sort of prescribe what's going to happen end? Like, I don't understand where that juxtaposition happens.
At the end of the, and I'm oversimplifying a fairly complex process, but at the end of this outreach and dialogue process with the public and interaction with city staff, there are going to be a couple of products. One's a specific plan, and one's a disposition and development agreement. The first is, what's this project going to look like? The second is the terms of the deal of a sale. And they have to agree, and the council has to agree, and this happens with public input during public meetings, that this is the way we want to go. It's got to make sense to the council, and it has to be approved by the council. It has to pencil out for the developer so that they can build it. And so it's an agreement between those two groups. Yeah, please.
And there are two more documents that go in there. There's a programmatic EIR that goes.
The environmental document.
Exactly, which is a hugely public process. And then there are project level EIRs that go in there that's even. So it's just a granular, very, very granular, very, very public process.
True.
I'm just going to say my last question. I'll sit down and not stand up again. And I think this is coming back towards Denise mostly. With respect to the water rights, and I don't want Dino to get a migraine, so I'm not going to say anything about paper water or anything like that. But where does the water rights on the Fort Ord land end, and where does the proven sort of permanent non-stressed resources that won't exacerbate, seawater intrusion, or what won't require new production of waters through recycled or desal, where do those things pencil out right now for that Fort Ord land?
So we are getting a little bit off of the housing element, but I think it's important to be able to talk about all of these questions. I just want the public and everyone to understand that this relates to the housing element in some way, because we're talking about available lands and sites for future housing. And so one of those available sites for future housing is in former Fort Ord. And then it has less constraints for water in former Fort Ord. So that's why this question is particularly to housing element. But the water rights and the availability of water within the former Fort Ord is a long-standing element. From the standpoint of the city and the housing element, the water is within the water management district, within the other areas outside of this, former Fort Ord. Within former Fort Ord, it's a former water allocation, as everyone knows, that's handed down from the Army. The groundwater comes from the Salinas Valley Groundwater Basin as opposed to Seaside Groundwater Basin, Carmel River Valley Basin, and the ASR project for the Delray Oaks and the Monterey Peninsula. At the question is, where is the water coming from, or how do we know the water's a real water rights? Okay. The water's coming from that area. It comes from a specific allocation. Marina Coast Water District is the overseer of the water allocation, similar to our Monterey Peninsula Water Management District. Marina Coast Water District has a water allocation process, and so does the FORA, that says each jurisdiction gets this amount. It was done originally through the FORA News Plan. It has been handed down and changed somewhat within this period of history. At the time when the developer comes forth with a development plan, as Dino mentioned, it will go before a number of different workshops, as I understand, and back and forth. One of the processes that is required under California law is that there be a water supply assessment, and then water supply verification report, as well as environmental documentation to show that there's water. I mean, it really is key when it comes to what would be, when it comes to the housing element, because we want to be able to have affordable housing, workforce housing, and that's one of the areas where we can actually achieve housing fairly with available land and the land sites. So, and we also have opportunities for, different types of other questions that were raised in terms of construction and things like that. So now I feel bad for poor Matt that's been sitting up here, so are there any other questions on that? Okay.
Gary Krieger, Quindell, and also the Planning Commission. Most of my questions have been touched on, so Dina, you were talking about when the type of housing be developed, and I'm getting a little better idea about that. Still a little unclear about the specifics of how that ties into the housing element, timing-wise, zoning changes, things like that. But you did I have a better feel for understanding how we get to the final mix of the housing, which I know is a big question for a lot of people. This kind of falls on Councilman Gagliardi's comment about the numbers, and can we trade down? And then usually, you trade up, but can we trade down and the above moderate, give up some of those if we replace them with, more of the very low moderate? I'm just curious about that, if that's a trade-off you can make. Obviously, I know you can't go the other way. I don't want to go the other way, probably. This is just a curiosity question. At some point, I was looking at the 1992 stuff, and it talked a lot of emphasis, and as some people mentioned, it's kind of uncanny how the 1992, what was written 97, what we're looking at today, a lot hasn't really changed. But the 92 was talking about the granny units, and I was just curious, how many granny units have we built since 1997, I guess, when they actually approved it? I was just curious if we really have built that many, and what that opportunity really is. I mean, it's one thing to put it on paper. Is that really an opportunity we have? That'd be something I'd like to look at. And I did not coordinate this with Katie at all, but I also was thinking about the second units, because you see a lot of this going on. My thought, though, was more does the housing element address the existing commercial, it's not a lot, but we do have some commercial areas. Is it, does this element, is that something that might address going in and retrofitting some of those with second stories that we could, use as more infill? Just, I don't know if that's something that goes into this or not. But there's a lot of one-story buildings out there, and might be able to throw a second story on a lot of them and get some, low income housing that way. I also won't mention paper water, so Dino's head doesn't blow up again. But water's litigious, it's got, anything you do with water, there's gonna be litigation. And I was just wondering, at the end, and I think you answered this, because there's the plan and what you actually do, but in the end, if litigation was not favorable and water became something that was a limitation, is that something that can help relieve us and avoid any penalties if we don't get these RENA requirements met? I mean, at the end of the day, if some other courts come in and say, hey, no, there's not that water, you can't do this. And that being said, I would imagine the more dense we build, the less water we're going to need. So that's always something to keep in mind. And, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions. I was just conferring, and I think Pat and I agree that you can trade or provide additional on the lower end in terms of with HCD. In terms of the 1992 and 1997 granny units, in terms of second units, those that were developed, I don't know, but that's one of the actual things that we have to define and provide in terms of this housing element. We have to identify what's been done since the last housing element and how many units have been created. So that's something I have to work with Kim and the city on to provide that data. And I think that that's a really interesting idea regarding the commercial on the ground floor and the second units, units on the top, and that's something that we can definitely consider in terms of a policy that would, again, we're at the housing element. We're not the developer or the elements from the city perspective. The city can say, we're interested in looking at policies that we would be able to allow zoning to provide residential uses in a commercial district. That's as simple as it is, and that's exactly what HCD would like to see within their housing elements, because what we're doing is we're expanding the opportunity to provide housing in different locations and not just focusing on one area. And I forgot your last question.
Oh, about the water. If it turns out we don't have the water, will that relieve us of any penalties that might come down if you don't get our numbers?
That's an important distinction. You're not penalized for not providing the units, constructing the units. You could be penalized for not adopting a housing element that's in compliance. The plan is the key thing. I'm so glad you asked that question, because that's an important distinction for tonight. We're really doing a planning document. And I want to make sure Matt doesn't forget his question.
Is there anybody else that wanted to talk that didn't get to? Because I don't want to hog the mic here.
That's what we're here for.
Okay, so I feel like I have a lot to learn. Like, the more everyone's talking, the more I'm like, oh, I think I'm going to go home, and in 2 weeks I'm going to have a lot more questions. I have a child that wants to be a teacher, so I love the idea of some lower income housing ownership. I think that's a great thing. Is one thing that's really on my mind is air pollution and noise pollution and traffic. And I don't know how all this fits in. I guess everybody knows we're looking at something with the airport that 15, 20 years from now could increase traffic significantly on 218. And then I think about, if we develop this Fort Ord land, is that, what's that going to do to the whole traffic situation? Are there any grants or any sort of state initiatives to help communities with, problems like this? I mean, in my opinion, 218 is already very crowded. And is there also, are there any incentives for like bike routes in housing? Or like anything that would encourage public transit or alternative ways of commuting. And like I said, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of other questions. Do we get another chance to ask questions after we think about it, or how does that work?
We're more than happy for you to provide questions in writing. On some of these, I think is it okay if I come up?
Please.
we're really getting great discussion and really interesting ideas and questions. And the combination of the traffic, transportation, and alternative transportation relates to the housing element in terms of your opportunity sites and where you're putting them. It relates in the way that gentleman just had the idea of putting your residential on top of your commercial, because you're talking about walkable communities and less transportation. And then the other questions are really about the future decisions the council's making in terms of future development that's coming before you. So I can't really comment on that, but there were some really good questions about funding sources that I think Matt's much better to address, if you can.
Sure, yeah, let me just take on a few of the questions that came up and be a little bit all over the place, but maybe it'll be helpful. So there was a question around the mixed-use piece, and in terms of, are there grants out there? What can the state do? Typically, most of the funding that's available from the state is for transit-oriented development, things that are super dense, that are typically pegged to, the San Francisco's, LA's, Oakland's of the world. So, there might be opportunities in the Central Coast, maybe Salinas or other places, maybe some on the peninsula where it's, there's very transit-rich, opportunities near transit centers and higher density opportunities. But I think it's going to be far and few between, and especially as you look forward, I think there's probably more fruit to bear in terms of looking at the project level, especially when you're looking at this master plan community. How can we take advantage of the opportunity where you have kind of a slate, you have a blank slate? What do we want that world to look like, and how can we reduce vehicle miles traveled? Because that is the number one impact that we are dealing with when we're talking about reducing carbon emissions. If we can get folks out of their cars, not only looking at the cars and trying to get the emissions out of the cars, right? But also reducing vehicle miles traveled also reduces the impacts to the roads and the need to continuously invest so much effort and time and energy on our transportation infrastructure. That said, this linkage between transportation and housing is just, you can't have one without the other. So looking at that, I'll mention that the thing on Garden Road that really surprised everybody, including myself, is when they did the traffic analysis, when you build out if you were to build out all of Garden Road now, because if you've been down there anytime recently by the airport, there is 40,000, 50,000 square feet of underutilized, unoccupied commercial square footage, right? Office space that has been a long time since anybody's been there. So, but when they do these analysis, you go to the maximum. You say, okay, if it were all utilized, what would the traffic impacts look like to these intersections, et cetera? They compared that versus, hey, if we've developed the southern portion of Garden Road, right, and you get to 405 units at maximum potential, it's going to be 5-10 years before you see that. But if that were to happen, what does that look like? It actually was less of an impact. The mixed use was a significantly lower impact than if you had the commercial. And when the discussion that came out about it was, if you start thinking about it, yes, you're going to have a lot of impact from residential and folks coming in and back and forth to their jobs, but you're taking folks that are currently going from Prunedale and Salinas to Monterey, and you're bringing them much closer. That's one thing. Secondly, on the commercial side, you have dental offices, other folks that are coming and going. There's so many more trips. So the trip calculator, actually, the multiplier is actually higher when you look at the commercial and light industrial versus raw residential. It's a little bit higher. So when you run the calculations, it spits out this huge number. So that's what kind of came out of that. Everybody was a little surprised about just that, because so something to keep in mind. And so I also want to make sure folks are careful when they bake in some assumptions around, okay, well, we would like this, commercial, below and residential above. We've just seen it where it doesn't work all the time. And then the worst thing to have is, expectations around commercial space, and then it sits vacant forever. You have a lot of that actually happening and it's actually an impediment or a barrier to development being able to pencil. You mentioned earlier, well, we don't want 100% of zero, right? It still has to be able to pencil from a development perspective. So we want to be careful and flexible about how much expectations to put around the commercial space. Dense, maybe less water. I'll mention that, energy efficiency and water kind of fits into that. The development today, in order to get something approved through the building code, is it's scoring you got to get an A+, right, to get there. And so, anything that's 10, 15, 20 years dated is going to be significantly less efficient from a water usage, from energy efficiency, everything. So the new stuff, we can expect to actually, pound for pound, is going to be, and we've actually seen this places in Santa Cruz where there's going to be 3,000 more beds in UC Santa Cruz, and it's actually going to have a net, there's no net increase in water usage, even though you're having all these different beds because of all the different things that they're doing there. So just something to keep in mind. The other thing I'll mention, someone mentioned meeting the goals. So yes, you have a lower threshold of goals. There's a wide recognition across the state that when they put the regional housing needs data together, there's a formula basically saying, well, here's what your census information looks like, and they project forward. So when folks took a hard look at that, let's say in 2014-15, for this planning cycle, they looked at demographic information and said, this is what the growth looks like, right? And they did calculations. It's kind of separate from the actual need that may be in the community. So this is why the community engagement process is so important, and actually doing a deeper dive in terms of what is the actual need out there. Case in point, when you looked at some of the data, they were saying, okay, well, the average size of homes that are needed across Monterey County, it's somewhere between 2.3 and 4, 5, 4-ish. But when you take the farm worker population, it's actually 7+. And overcrowded situations. So sometimes our data doesn't really do us justice. And I'm thinking that it's starting to happen on the peninsula where people are tripling up. There's a lot of students that are quasi-homeless. They're couch surfing. There's that kind of condition that kind of really needs to play out as well through this process to make sure that we kind of true up our data and our need so that when you put together a plan, that it truly is meeting your need. And don't get so fixated on saying, hey, we're just going to meet the 27, because that's kind of, getting a D. You'll pass, but are you really achieving the needs of your community? There's a wide recognition that the regional housing needs numbers aren't really meeting the actual needs of the communities. Putting that out there. Thank you.
Hi, Kim Shirley, Baxter Place. There's been a lot of great questions, and most of my questions have been answered, so I mostly just have comments. It seems like there's lots of possibilities for grants if we can get this done. The city obviously has some big things coming down the pike with the airport, and so I would request the council to really focus on this housing element. Denise can only work as fast as she can. So, but I feel like we need to really make sure that this remains a focus, because I think as soon as, if we can get this done, it sounds like it can open up a lot of opportunities. So I would request that. For me personally, it's hard to separate out the housing element and the land use from the general plan. It all seems to kind of run together in my mind. And so I really want to make sure, for instance, that we, again, look at open space. I think about the 17 acres. Personally, I wouldn't want a bunch of houses there, so I'd like to make sure that that's in their comments. I don't want big golf courses on Fort Ord. I don't want large houses. I know we've always talked about Delray Oaks increasing the walkability of Delray Oaks, and I know we have a hard time figuring out where that downtown might be, but if we can kind of think about this in a larger view. I know we want affordable housing. I'm super interested in that. More than 27 would be great. Looking at workforce housing, great. Mixed use, high density, I'm all for that. But we also need to think about how are we going to get to these places, or what are those people, if we do build houses in Fort Ord, where are they going to walk to? And even how does this connect with the FORTAG? going up in that way. We want to make sure that we are thoughtful with what we're planning, and that we really include, I like that idea of like including that idea that we have students. I'm a teacher. I see, I teach at NPC. I see, homeless students. We have needs out there, and so I'd like it if we can get as creative as we can with our housing, having mixed use in that we have students and seniors all living together. We have, we find ways to be creative. And so I'd be really excited about that. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Kim.
Kim, you were talking about something, I guess a quick question for when don't need to answer now, but the micro housing that you've been reading a lot about in the paper, different places. I know, a lot of big cities, Utah, of all places, I saw a big piece about, they're doing a lot of that. Does that count towards our requirements? Because, that's, some of those are, 400 or 500 square feet, but for a homeless student, that would be amazing, right? So I don't know, I guess my question would be, does that count towards our, our requirements? And that might be a much easier nut to crack if we, find some space for some of those. And anyway, thank you.
We're good. We're good.
Just a quick question, probably best for Matt. I know a lot of the legislation out there reduces a lot of the restrictions, like parking restrictions, height restrictions, so on. And it incentivizes a lot of things, multifamily housing and near transportation hubs and things like that. Is there anything that the legislature has mandated that we must meet, for example, out at the Fort Ord parcel, so that we include that when we're talking about, what specifically we want out there? I'm not sure, is there anything out there that mandates certain things is my question.
Right. So your consultant's going to have to scan the latest legislation for sure. Some of the things that this legislative cycle didn't achieve, they unfortunately weren't able to move forward with some of their more progressive thinking policies this year. It was SB 50 that was, I think you're referencing, that was trying to get more housing done near transit centers and job centers and all that. So that's put on hold for now. The stuff that passed last year, there were several pieces of legislation on off the top of my head, but the gist of it was that they're trying to force the issue with jurisdictions to follow their own plan. So a lot of this is, there are going to be sticks for folks that try to do, as an example, several cities out there, they say, hey, we'll allow 20 units an acre here, but then when it comes down to actually approval, they downzone, or they'll allow something that goes dramatically lower than that. And the developer says, you know what, I'll do it, 'cause 15 units an acre is better than nothing. And so a lot of times, what it's going to happen now going forward is, again, the developer would have a really strong case, or that there's actually stuff on the books in terms of the state legislation that would allow the developer to be made whole for that, or they would be able to litigate, or if local cities or somebody had an issue, they would be able to prevail in a court. So there's a lot of policies that center around downzoning and making sure that jurisdictions actually follow the plan that they put in place. Does that help?
Yeah, sure.
So just a couple things. So, Kim, great series of comments and questions. And I just want to say that I've got one eye on John and Edward back there, and they are writing feverishly. So this is a very productive meeting on several fronts, right? Not the least of which is the housing element, but I just really appreciate you saying what you're saying and them writing what they're writing. The other thing, a couple other points I wanted to make is, and this is a question actually for Denise. When I look back at the 97 to 2007 inventory, and it lists the 17 acres and the golf driving range, are we obliged to list those? Does the council have the choice to list them?
I think we have to go back to that slide that talks about what's in a site suitability analysis and in terms of what's needed. If there's adequate other sites that you can show, I don't think you're obligated to show them, but it's not, by listing those sites, you're not saying that this is where the land use elements or the council or the city wants housing. They just want to see where there are available sites where housing could occur.
Simply an inventory.
It's simply an inventory. It isn't a mandate, it isn't anything, because your policies can also dictate where you want housing. As a matter of fact, there was really very specific policies in the last housing element that did not get adopted, that talked about, even though at that time, I think the number of units was a little bit lower, that talked about over 200 units of affordable housing, including workforce housing, would be created. You know, it was a policy, draft policy that was in that plan, and there's, you know, you can do something like that and push housing in one location or another as part of your housing element. Or, you know, it really, we will come up with some options for the housing element policies, and look at that, but the simple answers, I don't think so. I'll have to.
I have a question or a comment. I know that not all of the acreage out at Fort Ord is suitable for housing. And that's been determined, so that would be reflected, I assume, in the housing element.
Right, there's actually two.
And also, the 17 acres, most of that's wetland. I believe there's only 5 or 6 acres at the most that's suitable for any kind of building on it, and it lacks water, or at least very limited water supply there.
And that was the result, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
So those would be listed then as of limited availability, or not, you know, of the X number of acres are here, but we can't build on it because of why.
That's absolutely right, and that's a better answer to what Dino just asked, because essentially, though you may list it, you will also identify the constraints and the fact that there isn't water, et cetera, and just exactly what you said. And in the former Fort Ord site, I know there's a pointer, but I can't find it, but the little knob of the blue, periwinkle blue, that's the square at the bottom, is also an area that is owned separately by the city, and that would be listed separately. In my mind, it needs to be listed as a potential site too. It also has somewhat less of the treescape in certain areas of that property. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Denise, any wrap-up? Matt?
My wrap-up is, we really appreciated the opportunity to listen and the many questions, and we look forward to, we appreciate Matt's involvement and help, and we also had a Spanish translator here I want to put on the record too.
Oh, nice.
So that was, I wanted to thank him for coming. Oh, great.
Do you do childcare?
So thank you.
Denise, can you just tell us, like, what is next?
Next steps. Next steps is Denise goes to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Literally, we need to develop each of those components that we talked about, and there's a lot of just writing that needs to be done to update, to actually, it's not really an update, it's preparing a new plan. So we've tried to think about maybe coming back in either end of July or August with some of the policy work, and then immediately thereafter trying to get out the draft document to, come before you one more time, and then come before you with, here's a draft, which again, it goes to Planning Commission and City Council after it's drafted and it's public reviewed for approval. So if you look at just the steps in our scope of work, et cetera, we're taking us all the way through December in this process, and it still has to be pushed in that to make it happen.
Will we have one more public workshop outside of a regular planning commission and/or city council meeting?
It's at the liking of the council and the planning commission. We can do that in the format when we come back with the policies, would be our next time. And it really is at your will.
What I would suggest, Mayor, is that we shoot for a late July, early August workshop that allows a discussion about very draft policies so that we can get that input then and keep things moving forward. Does that work for you?
I'm not going to account for early August or end of July, but I'm going to say end of July at the very earliest and mid to end of August at the very latest. It has to come back to by the end of August, and then to get a document out the next, within that time frame. So that's our schedule.
So sometime in August.
Yes. And Dina would like early August, so. So noted.
Thank you all for coming. Any last comments? No?
Just a quick one. So, first of all, thanks for everybody that came and spoke. Thank you. There are obviously a lot of interrelated processes here that are super important, all of them. And as part of our ongoing desire to ensure that our public's informed and understands the processes and how they interrelate, don't hesitate to call or write me about process questions. I am happy to. I've been in the Krieger's living room talking about planning, and I'm happy to do that. I just can't tell you how much I'd rather do that than read a vitriolic string on Nextdoor, right? About how we're not communicating in some way. I'm happy to do it. Happy to do it. And as we start these processes, whether it be an exclusive negotiating agreement process with a developer, continue the housing element process, discuss perhaps other elements of the general plan being updated. It's all exciting, and it's all interrelated, and it is a learning process for me as well as everybody else. So.
All right. So again, thank you all for coming. If I would suggest personally reaching out to somebody in the crowd that you may not know. We have some pretty important folks in the crowd, so that hopefully we will be working with for a long time. So thank you for your evening, and we're adjourned.